So, just a brief introduction of both of us in a way. We just sum it up. We've had a lot of corporate experience in advertising, sales, marketing, in office automation, in consumer electronics, in telecom, media, blah blah blah. But it's music that we've always been with, right from when we were children, at home, surrounded by music, surrounded by musicians, our parents, relatives, and that's something that has been with us right through. In fact, taking a few key points from Mr. Virendra's presentation of reinventing imagination and creativity, I think these things resonate with us as musicians, and we always held this very close to us. And what has been constant is the passion as musicians. When I say passion, I mean not just passion, but always to develop your skill set right through and not be disheartened, disillusioned by anything that comes away. To give you an example, we've grown up in an era, technology was shortwave radio. I heard something about ham radio, and that also kind of resonates with what we've grown up with. I'm still happy, I'm quite happy that ham radio still exists. It's a great medium of communication. We grew up with shortwave radio. So the point we're trying to make is, there is no PPT here today. We want you all to listen because that's what we've grown up with. Listening has been key to our growth, right as musicians, right from where we started. And therefore, audio, no visual. Audio is what we've been, concerned with right through. And when I say shortwave radio, a small example. A song comes, you want to learn the song. You only have that program to learn that song. Then you have to wait for it to come again. So, which means you have to be ready at all times. And with all the static, I don't know if any of you have ever operated a shortwave radio. It might seem obsolete, you might find it some antique shop, but it was very much the technology of those days. And of course, vinyl, LP records. I don't know whether you might be aware if you Google, and that's very much in vogue again now. So these were our mediums from which we soaked in all kinds of music. Old Hindi film songs, Tamil songs, Kannada songs, whatever, all from films, and also Indian classical, and also jazz and world music. So, to cut a long story short, when we decided to start MoonArra after quitting the corporate world, which means it's no longer vertical axis, it's going horizontal now, this way, which means you're entering into a completely unknown realm. It's still unknown. That's one thing about music or anything, as Mr. Virendra also pointed out. There is no destination. You reach the city, you're performing a concert, that's it. From there you go on somewhere else, something on, something comes next. Then some other idea strikes you, you begin to compose, then you have a new song. It's a constant process of evolving and developing your skill set, and always immerse yourself in creativity and spontaneity. Unrehearsed sometimes is what brings the best. Today, when I'm observing all the arrangements that are being made here, you have to be prepared also for any eventuality that may happen. As individuals and as engineers, there is nothing called perfection. It's a myth. Perfection is something that lies in the eyes of the beholder. What you may seem perfect, somebody else might look at it and say is imperfect. So the point is of being present, and anything that may happen, like this mic might fade. I'm okay with it. I can even step off stage and maybe talk to you as long as I'm audible. So technology comes next. Your ideas, your content is what will always come first. And that's what we've really been concerned with. And to come to something like MoonArra, MoonArra means 3 streams. It's actually a Malu word, MoonArra, and Tamil. So 3 rivers, 3 streams. So anglicized, we made it MoonArra, which means Indian classical, jazz, and world music streams form the core of what we perform. And we have recorded albums, composed songs which resonate with musicians, and it's a constant collaboration. And we're always meeting new musicians and finding out the same song that we perform can be performed in many different, many zillion ways, actually. And we are still discovering how the same song can be presented again, because it's boring to do the same song the same way. In a sense, it's not Bollywood, we're not mainstream music, but yet there exists this niche that allows you to constantly transform, reinvent, explore, and with resonating with today's theme, metamorphosis. Meta is such a big word today, isn't it? Used everywhere in technology. Meta, I'm still understanding what meta really means. It's got so many meanings associated with it, philosophy, technology, and Mark Zuckerberg has used meta, and he's used it with something else, all that blah, 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 fine. But yes, the whole idea is, what do you change and what do you do when you reinvent yourself and you adapt? Basically, the word is adapting to conditions and never losing your cool. That's tough, I know. Sometimes the ACs may go off in the hall. That's okay. It's a matter of something failing, but you're not going to fail as a person or a human being. And that's what we've always held very dear to us. Even when you're performing overseas, anything can happen, But you can't blame something else for the lack of, whatever happens. As long as it's fair and being done, that's how we always looked at MoonArra. And one of the most important things that we have found is jazz. I don't know how many of you listen to jazz music, or you're probably aware, and the word is being used and in different connotations, even fashion, saying, oh, all the jazz. But jazz is a form of music. You could probably Google, you'll get the history of the music, where it came from, and all that. But it has allowed us to have such an open mindset. So you're able to take in anything and without any prejudices. And constantly you're imagining new things with jazz. And this discernment, I like to use the word discernment, which means you're not listening to something, you just surface, driving in a car, putting on music and saying, yeah, it's great. But we're actually listening to something and trying to understand the depth of where the music came from, peel away the layers, and so on, so forth. So that's what makes it an artistic piece of work. And that's precisely what jazz has taught us, allowed us to be more sensitive. The sensitivity, I think, is really high. So we can discern at the end of the day if we don't like something or like something. If we like something, what is it that we like in that? And therefore, that allows us, again, back as musicians to examine our work, re-examine and reinvent, so to speak, and constantly keep changing and adapting. I stress this, constantly changing, never lose hope or to be disillusioned. So passion has always been the constant factor, and I think the day you lose interest in something, that's quite tragic. And I hope it never comes to that. So I'll hand over to Madhuri to give her view of this metamorphosis and how we're looking at it.
I'm Madhuri. Hello, everybody. I come from a learning and development background. I also qualified to be a teacher because most of the women in my family were all wonderful teachers. But I found that I was not really a good teacher. I was a better student. So I shifted into learning and development. And so you're constantly learning. So that allowed me to be a student constantly and be constantly in the state of learning. And just about anything can be developed. So metamorphosis, it's what happens, right, in nature, as part of nature's plan. But in human beings, we have to make a conscious effort to constantly develop in a proper fashion as much as possible so that it becomes progressive, as our previous speaker said, and not regressive. There are things, and of course, but still it's a constant process of live and learn, but at the same time, there are a few steps, at least we found in our professions, both of us, Jagadeesh and I, that it kind of enables you to, if you make a conscious effort, how to change. So some of the steps, at least I followed, and I kind of bring it to his notice constantly. One of the first things is, I just mentioned 4 points. One of the first things is to always, while you're seeing the smaller picture, always very important to see the bigger picture. Why I say this is because that's one of the things. See, it's all very well in theory, but when you actually go out into the field of music, in our case, meeting new musicians, meeting people constantly, you are basically in the people's industry also. So that is a really very, very, it's a very gray area constantly when you're meeting new people. So it's important for everybody to see the smaller picture as well as the bigger picture. Because sometimes in the smaller picture, we all think, we kind of tendencies to think that you're really good or you have no cause to improve and and then you go out into the world looking at the bigger picture and you realize, like when you're in nature, you realize that you're such a small speck. You're really not all that big. But what happens in the smaller picture sometimes, especially in the arts and music, tendency of the ego to develop. All of us have an ego, but one of the things I've found is that it's constantly important to kind of keep these, for smooth functioning of everything, events, it's always constantly good to see that we can't control things, can't control everything, and that we have to look at the smaller picture and see that we're ultimately human beings, and then there's the bigger picture. Another thing is constantly looking at the inner environment. We tend to always look at the external environment. There is something called interiority. So sometimes in performance, that's something I like to present rather than something that's happening outside, something that's happening inside. Because the mind is very important for smooth functioning, for things to take place smoothly. So always, as much as is possible, given the fact that we're always in the process of doing, looking at the outside, also go back and reflect and look at the inside. You can do it anywhere actually, it's such an easy thing to do, and yet we never exercise that option. It also helps you with the value of choice. I'll give you an anecdote. Actually, when I took up training and development as a consultant, learning and development, they made me an offer to become training director at some point. And in my mind, I was like, oh, now I can come and tell Jagadeesh, I was one of those few women who was chosen to become training director, blah, blah, blah. But when I got home in the evening, I was thinking about the whole thing and just thought, what was my original plan? What was our original plan? It was to do music. So that's why we were making, to be a sustainable musical force, or something that we wanted, a sustainable musical entity. We thought we needed to kind of get there. Instead, I suddenly got detracted by somebody saying training director. But when I went back, I realized I would never have lasted one day in that job, so maybe it's not a good thing. So I turned the offer down, and for a long while I regretted it. And sometimes even in my state of ego, I'm like, oh, maybe I should have been this training director or learning director. And this colleague of mine, she went on to do really well. So that is one thing. It's very important to reflect to see what works for you, not for somebody else, or not for society, always. Which comes to the next point, the relationship between you and another, the self and another person. One should always, as much as possible, while thinking of what we want, what I want, okay, thinking of what the other wants. That's very important, especially for us in relationships, musical relationships, personal relationships, professional relationships. Very, very important to kind of always think of the other. So that also helps you develop a sense of empathy without compromising on what you want, and yet you see what the other wants as much as possible. And another thing is timing. Timing, see, we have time, but timing is very, very crucial to everything. You have comic timing, you have dramatic timing. Timing in an operation, the surgeon just can't go wrong. There's just that split second. You have that split second to do something. The previous speakers talked about something about accident was going to happen, and what is that thing that happens? That is timing. So we've learned along the way that timing, given the fact that we are human beings, things can go this way and that timing is very important. And also I'd like to, since I'm a student of psychology, I'd also like to talk about two psychologists. I just briefly say, because one of them, those who I follow, one of them is a theory developed by Erik Erikson. It was a socio-psychological theory of development, changes that happen. How is it possible to metamorphosize in a proper fashion? So at our stage, we are presented with where we can become stagnant or we can generate. So it goes through from childhood, from infancy, right up to old age. So in our stage, in your stage, you are probably young adults, adolescents. It says that identity versus role confusion. So if your metamorphosis is proper, then you will have an identity, sense of identity, instead of role confusion, which is very possible at this age. And at our age, in our stage, we could become stagnant because, and it's easy to become stagnant after a while, but you can still contribute. It says that you can contribute even later, because the next stage is, so I just mentioned it briefly, the next stage is integrity versus despair. That's in really old age. You can still have that sense of integrity and contribute in different ways, and instead of despair. And another psychologist is Abraham Maslow. Please look him up on Google, his hierarchy of needs. Thank you.
Thank you so much.